All right. Hello again, everybody. For those of you just joining me, my name is Amira Nelson. I'm the Senior Outreach Officer for the Fulbright Specialist Program. I'm really pleased to be here with you today, together with two of our esteemed Fulbright Specialist Program alumni, Jesse Weens and Rumu Sarkar. And we're going to be presenting to you today about the Fulbright Specialist Program. So hopefully you'll leave after this next hour and 15 minutes with a much better understanding of this program and a good sense of the experience and your next steps in the path to a Fulbright Specialist Award. So I'm going to turn things over now to Rumu, who is going to be speaking about her experience in a very different part of the world in Poland.
Thank you so much. First of all, welcome to everyone who's participating in this conversation. I'm delighted to be invited to be part of this conversation by Amira. Thank you very much. I'm going to be talking about my specialist grant, which was done to Poland, the John Paul II School of Law in Lublin, Poland, back in 2016. And I will explain how I got a standing ovation. I felt like a prima ballerina, which is not usual for lawyers, I have to say. Next slide, please. The reason I did a Fulbright is that it came about in a very unexpected but wonderful way. At the time, I was an adjunct law professor at Georgetown University Law Center here in Washington, D.C. And I attended a seminar on some obscure topic. And I met up with the dean of the Xiamen School of Law, which is in Xiamen, China. He was actually doing a Fulbright scholarship at Georgetown Law. And so I met him at this conference and he started to talk to me. And next slide, please. Much to my surprise, he had actually read a book that I'd written, International Development Law. This particular edition was published by Oxford University Press. There's now a newer edition published by Springer. But what really surprised me about his interest in my book is that he focused on the chapter that I'd written on whether there was a human right to development. And he wanted me to come to his law school to teach that particular subject. And I was quite honestly taken aback. Teaching human rights in China did not seem copacetic. I was a bit, maybe even alarmed his interest in that particular part of the book. But it turned out to be really, really an amazing experience. And so what he said to me in terms of coming to his law school to teach, he said, please come, but you have to get a Fulbright in order to come and fund your trip to Xiamen. And that also sort of took me aback because that was an interesting sort of precondition. But that's what started this whole process. And I'm very, very glad that I did, in fact, apply for a specialist grant, and I did get one. However, by the time I got it, it was too late to use it in China because there's a Chinese Fulbright office that I guess has a lot of people in the queue. And so even though I got the grant, I wasn't able to use it. I did go to Xiamen and I did teach them on whether there's a human right to development, but I actually used my grant in Poland at the invitation of Father Bronsky, who is a really delightful, very dynamic professor. And it was at his invitation that I went to Poland. It was wonderful. Thank you. So as Jesse was explaining, usually specialist grants are 6 weeks long. He stayed for almost a semester. In my case, it was exactly the opposite. I basically let the law school know that I would not be available for 6 weeks, but only for 2 weeks because I had family obligations. My parents were aging and I needed to be accessible to them, and 6 weeks was a little bit too much time away abroad. So they went back to the Fulbright Commission and they got it shortened to 2 weeks. But what happened in that 2 weeks was absolutely fabulous, because what happened is that they organized a 2-week advanced law seminar for about 80 or more of their law students. And of course, I don't speak Polish. They all had to sort of listen to me and understand what was being said in English. And the subject matter of this 2-week law seminar was also incredibly advanced and difficult to sort of grasp some of the underlying concepts, because what I was actually teaching them on was part of my book, International Development Law. The first part of that book really dealt with the historical, philosophical, and sort of substantive law principles, including a human rights dimension to development. So for those of you who are, I haven't explained my background, I started my career in 2 different law firms on Wall Street. And even though I'd gone to college in New York, I went to Columbia, I really wasn't happy in New York. So when I got the offer to join the Office of the General Counsel at the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, I was thrilled and moved down to DC. So that really began my career, my law career in international development. So the book that I wrote, because I was teaching at Georgetown and there was no textbook on international development questions, was divided into 2 parts. As I said, the first part was historical, philosophical, substantive principles of international development law. And the second half dealt with a far more complex undertaking in terms of how to finance international development projects overseas, not just USAID based, but World Bank and just generally. And so what this 2-week seminar in Poland really focused on was about the formation of capital markets in support of international development. So once I explained how these capital markets are formed overseas in Africa and Asia, I also talked about how these capital markets can be corrupted by 3 different factors. One is transnational organized crime. So those are people who were involved in, guns trafficking, people trafficking, selling, killing animals and selling their parts illegally. Transnational crime, gun running, they're not a savory group of people, that's for sure. And they can affect international capital markets. I also focused on Islamic-based terrorist groups who are also using capital markets to fund their illegal activities. And of course, there's general corruption in banking, both locally within the local banking system as well as internationally. So it was a very complex sort of set of questions and set of discussions. Next slide, please. There were a couple of things that were very interactive. Professor Bronsky, whom you see on the right, asked me to do a couple of things that I was not expecting to do. First of all, he wanted me to talk about US constitutional law. And for those of you who are familiar with law in America, constitutional law is bedrock law, and it takes a year of a first-year class that's a year long. And I don't teach constitutional law, so I was really taken aback by this. But because they're so familiar with, concepts that are constitutional law concepts in the United States, they really wanted me to talk about it. So what I did is that I took the Bill of Rights, amendments 1 through 10 to the US Constitution, and concentrated on a couple of those amendments. But that was really interesting to see that they really wanted to be interactive. They really wanted to understand constitutional law principles, which was really outside my remit. But I'm glad that I focused on that. And I also did a comparison between Polish law principles and how they interface with US principles. Now, there are 3 points in terms of my particular seminar that were highly unusual in this context. Not unusual for me, but unusual for my Polish law students. One, as you may already know, Poland is basically a civil law jurisdiction, a civil law country, which means that their law essentially is based on Roman law. And so civil law is very different from common law. Common law comes from, England. So in terms of American law, it's considered to be Anglo-American common law or Anglo-American jurisprudence. There are other countries such as Australia, I think Canada, that also follow common law principles, but it's bedrock in terms of US law. But it's different in terms of civil law. So the fact that I was coming from a common law basis was the first thing that was different for my Polish law students. The other thing dealt with legal pedagogy. How is law taught? Now, in Poland and most civil law countries throughout Europe and throughout the world, law school is very much a professor lecturing to their students. There isn't so much Q&A at the end of each lecture or throughout the lecture format. It's very structured and it's very sort of focused, centered on the law professor, him or herself. Now, of course, I was lecturing, but I also throughout my lectures I did pose questions to my students, and I said, please answer my questions within the lecture. And what I really did that was highly unusual for them is that I divided this very large class, 80 plus people, into groups. I told them they can choose their partners, their negotiating partners. I divided them into groups and I gave them within the course of 2 weeks, and I was teaching 4 days each week. I gave them 3 exercises. that were original questions they'd never seen before. I divided them into groups. They had to research and, make a presentation orally. They would come to the stage at the front of the class, all groups, and would make their presentations in terms of how they would resolve this particular legal question. So not only was I asking them questions during the course of my own lecture, but I expected them to solve legal problems within a group setting, present their findings to the class as a whole, come up to the stage and speak in English. So it was really difficult for them, and I think the Polish law professors who were assisting me and watching the seminar were really surprised. It was not something they were used to. Next slide, please. So one thing I noticed about this new sort of legal pedagogical methodology, that's a lot of big words, that I was using in terms of making them solve problems, making them solve legal problems. For example, I noticed that in Poland, they had a really good telecom system. So I just invented a fact pattern where a fictional African country had approached Poland and said, hey, we've looked at your telecom system, your internet system, we're really impressed. Would you come to our country and set up a similar system? And, it was a way of presenting an international development problem that I think Polish law students, or maybe Polish people in general, really hadn't thought through or hadn't really thought of in terms of giving aid and participating in international development directly. So they love this teaching, and they just they really took to it, and their presentations were absolutely superb. And I told them at the end that they did more work and harder work than even my Georgetown law students were doing, because I was teaching over the course of a semester every day to folks who essentially were English speakers. There were, of course, foreign law students, but for the most part, they were English speaking law students. So when we finished, because it was an English language seminar, they were all being given certificates certifying that they had completed an English language advanced law course. And so we were giving out these certificates. I insisted that they give them chocolates as well. And at the end of the course, we were wrapping up, and it was the last day, and I was really surprised because all of a sudden they all stood up at the same time and started clapping, and I was like, I don't quite understand what this is. And then two of my guy law students came up to the stage with these bunches of flowers, and then it finally dawned on me, oh my God, this is a standing ovation, and it's for me. So I did the only thing reasonable under the circumstance. I burst into tears. I was just not expecting this. And so when I finally got a hold of myself, the only thing I could say is, my mother tells me I cry too much. But it was really, really touching and really moving and completely unexpected. I was completely startled in the best possible way. So next slide. So in terms of that experience, the other thing I want to say is that I also used, I don't know if people have seen Law and Order. It's a long-running TV series on American TV, but I was surprised that Polish people watch so much American TV, and they start watching cartoons when they're little kids. And so I used one of the episodes from Law and Order that dealt with money laundering, which was one of the issues that we were talking about in the class, and showing them that that film, that episode from Law and Development, I think was very interesting for them too, because again, it put a human dimension in terms of teaching. So I used a lot of teaching methods that they were not familiar with, but I think it worked out well. Afterwards, since Fulbright is based at the State Department here in Washington, D.C., this is pre-COVID, so there were a lot of happy hours and events and other sorts of interesting Fulbright-sponsored talks and films and everything. And so I met another Fulbrighter. He was a doctor. He actually does kidney transplants, and he had privileges at the Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C. For those of you who know it, it's in Bethesda, Maryland. And he was also a member of the faculty of the Uniformed Services University School of Medicine. And for those of you who may not be familiar with that, that is actually the Pentagon's medical school for its active duty doctors and global health specialists and nurses. So he introduced me to the Air Force colonel who ran the Global Distance Learning Program. And essentially, Colonel Botig is his name. He was delighted to find me and to add me to their assistant faculty, because he was running the Global Distance Program. And even though by profession he's a pediatrician. I mean, he had this amazing grasp over international development issues, and he was very concerned that the medical students, the doctors, the global health specialists understand not just the medicine involved, but the law involved. And so when he met me and realized that I'd been teaching international development law for quite a number of years at that point, I was added to their faculty. And I began teaching international development law to medical doctors and medical students, not law students. And that was really interesting, really, really interesting, because I found that these medical students were very adapted, grasping international law questions, which actually surprised me because a lot of them have strictly science backgrounds and not so much liberal arts backgrounds. But they really took to the concepts and grasped them very, very quickly and very comprehensively. I did try to focus the work, the lectures that I was doing in terms of global health issues, but we certainly even went beyond that. And I also taught another modality, or they're called modules, in terms of international humanitarian law. So the laws that affect medical professionals during times of war or post-war periods where they're overseas and they're just entering into conflict zones or post-conflict zones. There are a number of, conventions and different laws that control that sort of activity. So that's the other thing I taught at US USA's Uniformed Services University. So in terms of a professional outcome, it led to a completely different dimension of my teaching. I did not expect to be teaching in medical school. Next slide, please. And so what happened after that is that I'm also teaching at this point at Case Western Reserve University Law School, which is in Cleveland, Ohio. I'm teaching virtually. I taught last semester, last spring. I'm going to be teaching this coming spring 2024. I know that the American Bar Association rules have changed now that we're in a post-COVID era. So I'm hoping that I can teach and maybe go to campus twice out of the semester, because I'm not planning to actually move to Cleveland. But that's been a really wonderful experience for me too. It's continuing. I know the law dean, he and I have been friends for a number of years, a long, long time, as a matter of fact. And I'm thinking about sort of expanding the international development law course and textbook into an institute or a center where I can expand it into doing clinics and other types of, and conferences and other types of publishing. So the Fulbright in Poland was really the start of a wonderful experience, both personally and professionally for me. It led to a lot of downstream, a lot of wonderful opportunities for me. And in terms of, the lessons learned from, I think, practically every Fulbrighter, but certainly for me, it got me to a point where I could share and experience a different way of looking at law, a different way of looking at our legal experiences, our ways of approaching law issues, not just from the Polish point of view, but just generally in terms of how people look at things, differently. I found that we could collaborate and share experiences, across borders and across experiences. And it was really very, very, it was fun. It was really a delightful experience. I learned a lot. I mean, I hope my students definitely learned from me, but I certainly learned a lot from them too. So next slide, please. So the startling thing I learned is that common law principles can be applied to civil law jurisdictions. And that's true not only in Poland, but that's been true, I think, overall in terms of my teaching and my professional experiences going to different parts of the developing world. In fact, I'm planning to write an article about that for the Fulbright magazine. I forget exactly what it's called, but I think that's an important lesson for lawyers to keep in mind. In fact, I find that there is a shift from civil law, or Lex Romana, as it's called, to common law, and that's a huge, huge sea change in terms of international law generally. And in terms of the specific doctors that I do teach at USIS, I hope that now that they have this perspective in terms of how law intersects with their medical practice, that they have a better understanding of these really complex environments and cultures and countries that they're going into, because as everyone knows, the US military is deployed internationally. They're not just in the United States, but they're everywhere. So next slide, please. So thank you. My Fulbright experience, as I like to tell people, was both enduring and endearing. I was asked to do a Fulbrighter snapshot, which was an interview with me. It's available at this particular website where I was interviewed. It's not a film, it's just an interview where you can read more about my experience in Poland. Thank you so much. Happy to answer any questions you have.